right, so this week I mentioned we're having the second of a two-part series on the design of life, and so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Last week we talked about how life is special. There's something different about life, and so we talked about some of what that was. I love this quote from Michael Denton. He said, "Life is the greatest discontinuity in the universe." So you guys who know math know what a discontinuity is. It's basically a break, right? A break in the line, a break in the graph. So you have one equation for one part of the graph, and then there's a break. Either it's a sharp point or actually a step or something like that. You need a different equation for the next section of graph. So that's called a discontinuity. It kind of loses connection with the past, so to speak, and that's the way life is. It's the greatest discontinuity in the universe, and it just it points out, I think, how different life is. And I pointed out here, you see the moon in the distance, and it's a dead world, and you see the earth, and it's just full of life. So today we're going to talk about some more wonders. So I have a lot of videos to show you, video clips from YouTube. So we're going to talk about the wonders of reproduction. We're going to talk about the wonders of the human body, not so much, but I'm going to point you in some directions where you can investigate it further. We're going to talk about the wonders of complex program behaviors. If you want to know what those are, you'll find out later when we get to there. All right, and then we're going to get on. I think I'm putting more emphasis on this time because of our discussion we had last week. So we're going to talk about, well, what is evolution? And then what is the intelligent design movement? And then I'm going to present some answers to objections that are raised to the design in nature, in particular life. So that's kind of our agenda today, and should be able to get all through it because I've overthought everything. So anyway, all right. So talking about the wonders of reproduction. So you think Think of a Tesla. If you had a Tesla, wouldn't it be nice if the Tesla could reproduce, and then you could have more Teslas and you can make a lot of money, right? Well, what would it take to do that? Well, right now Teslas are made by factories, not by other Teslas. So what you have to do is you have to put a factory inside of the Tesla. All right? Now that factory can produce another Tesla. Well, what kind of Tesla it is? It's a Tesla without a factory. It can't reproduce, and so eventually it ends up in the junkyard. So I think what that does is it points out the difficulty of self-reproducing anything, and that's it. It's kind of a recursive thing, okay? So now we have a Tesla that has a factory in it that produces a factory that produces a Tesla. And what does it produce? It produces a factory that produces a Tesla, and that Tesla produces a Tesla, which ends up in the junkyard. So you just have this recursiveness. Recursive means you have to go do it over and over again. So you take the answer from your problem and you plug it back into the problem again, and you keep going round and round. So that's what we mean by recursiveness. So I think that points out the difficulty of these self-replicating machines. And of course, that's one of the fundamental aspects of life is reproduction, self-replication. Talked about DNA. So DNA is this, remember if we talked about Max, being increased in height by a factor of 60,000. His nose is actually in space. If you took his DNA and you looked at it, the DNA would be the width. The width of the DNA would be equivalent to the thickness of a sheet of paper. So now you scale that down by 60,000, and that's the actual width of a DNA molecule. Well, the DNA molecule is actually an information-bearing medium, and that medium, so it's a stair-step type structure. It has this helical nature, but if you flatten it out, it's really a stair-step, and those rungs form individual letters in a code. It forms like a language. So the codes specify the amino acids and the relative, and then the sequence of those amino acids now are tell you how to build proteins, and proteins are the machinery within the cell. So they're also structure, they're the machinery, they have a number of different functions within the cell. But that information is all stored in this ladder-like structure. We talked about how information is actually independent of the medium. So you could take this same information, these same letters, and you can write them on a piece of paper. You can store them on a hard disk or on a hard drive like Al does. So, so anyway, and what's interesting about this molecule is it's redundant, okay? So you have the letters T, G, C, and A, And whenever you have a T on one side, it always mates with an A on the other side. And if you have a G, it always mates with a C and so forth. So if you know what the letter is on one side, you know what the complementary letter is on the other side. And so because of that information, if you split the ladder down the middle, you have the information on both sides. Now you have the information available to construct two ladders instead of one. So this is, information now being copied, duplicated. And what I think is kind of interesting, Al can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you, on the one side, the letters kind of go in one direction, but if you look at the other side, they're complementary, they kind of go in the opposite direction.
Reverse complement.
Yeah, reverse complement. So, you go purple, on the right side, you go blue, green, blue, purple, yellow, purple. Now you go to the other side, start at the blue, that's a T, it's blue, green, blue, purple, yellow. So it's, like that. It's pretty weird. And you're going to see that when the DNA molecule is duplicated, that adds some complication to the process. But it's pretty cool. So here's a diagram from Wikipedia. If you really want to understand this stuff without getting a PhD, you could at least get a cursory understanding by go to Wikipedia. So you see this DNA ladder, and so the ladder has to be split, and then the missing rungs on each side have to be restored. And on the one side, that's easy. That's on the right side. And so it's relatively easy. But on the other side, you have to do it in reverse. And so you have this complicated process where you're building up the steps in the ladder reverse, and then you have to kind of reset, and then you do it. So you do it again and so forth. So it actually requires a lot of different proteins or enzymes, which engineers would call those machines. All right, they're machines, they're mechanisms, and so forth. So anyway, so you see on the right side, you have this thing called helicase, and what that does is that splits the two halves of the ladder apart. And then you have this protein that starts putting on those rungs on the ladder. And then you have a clamp to kind of keep things from unraveling. And so there's a number of different processes on there. On the right side, you have to have certain proteins that accomplish what something called annealing for the DNA. On the left side, because you're going in reverse, it's kind of the opposite. So you can see a lot more proteins involved and so forth. So it's a pretty complicated process. And so I think, when an engineer looks at something like this, we think sophistication, we think design, and so forth. So you think of, okay, you got the DNA molecule, something has to start it splitting. Something has to put all these mechanisms in place at the right time, at the right place. And somehow a signal has to be sent to tell the cell to stop doing certain other things. So it's kind of a complicated process. It's a sophisticated process just reproducing the DNA. Now there's one mechanism, one thing that happens is as you're splitting the rungs in the ladder, you start building up these twisting forces inside of the upstream DNA. And you have something called, what's it called? Al knows what it is. Topoisomerase. But what this does is as you twist the DNA, it starts going into these big loops, like you're twisting a rubber band, and all of a sudden it starts going haywire. And so you get these supercoils, and that can eventually shut the whole process down. And so you have a certain protein complex that somehow ends up in the right place and snips one loop, part of the loop of the DNA, passes the other through, and then glues the stuff back together, and then continues on. It's pretty wild. So I wanted to show you an animation of that. So I think that's just one of those little proteins, which they're little machines, mechanisms, electromechanical devices, I guess, from a mechanical engineer's perspective. So we saw that. So now the next question is, how do you store the DNA? Now you got double the DNA, but you have to store it, and there's a whole process of storing the DNA in an orderly way inside of the nucleus of the cell, because it has to store it and it has to be able to access the information when it needs it to make new proteins. And so they use these other proteins called histones, and those histones form as little spools. So you wrap little portions of the DNA around the spool, and then you have these linkers, and you have this whole set of beads, which are like these, the beads are called nucleosomes, and then those are all coil together into a larger coil, which then coils into a larger coil, and eventually you end up with your chromosome. And so you're going to see an animation of that process too. It's pretty cool.
Every time a cell has to replicate, it has to go through everything like that?
Mm-hmm. In fact, it takes a cell, I read that a cell takes several hours for the DNA in a single cell to duplicate itself.
When we're sleeping and all that, we don't even know.
Well, not when you're sleeping. Not kidding. Yeah, all the time. Because what happens is your cells, or you have cells in your body. You have like, I don't know, trillions, like 60 trillion cells or something like that in your body. Certain percentage of them are dying all the time. They die for various reasons. Sometimes the cells die because they detected an error in themselves and they command themselves to kill themselves. So it's a whole process of quality control and the garbage disposal and all that involved in your body and in each individual cell. So, but anyway, so your cells, the dead cells, have to be replaced, and so your body is always producing new cells.
Amazing.
Yep.
Each cell does it for 46 molecules. So the DNA.
Yeah. So the thing is you have one strand of DNA, but you don't. You actually have 46 strands of DNA that have to be duplicated within the cell. In each cell.
In every cell.
Yeah, 46 chromosomes, so each chromosome is a strand of DNA.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, yeah, it is. So I'll show you the next video. So, incredibly complex. You talked about, we could design machines. Well, that's actually being done right now. Viruses, there's these, what are they called? The ones that infect bacteria. Yeah, bacterial phages. So the protein shell, so bacteria usually has two membrane containers, so to speak. It's a double membrane, and so it's harder to get through for a virus to get through. So these viruses have a little hypodermic needle integrated to them, so they can inject and penetrate both membranes and inject their DNA into the bacteria so that it'll reproduce and kill the bacteria. And they're doing research on that because you could tailor these macrophages to kill particular diseases that you're trying to eliminate without harming the rest of your body, like antibiotics. They just target the bacteria that they're targeted for and hit nothing else. So anyway. All right, so that's what's going on in cell, and of course, I just like to say this is kind of the outskirts of God's ways in a way. There's still so much that they don't know about the cell and how it reproduces. The next video I want to show you is real photography of an embryo growing. So right now we talked about a single cell dividing, but when you're making a multi-cellular organism like a person, those cells, you start with a fertilized egg, which is a single cell, and that cell divides again and again, and somehow those cells begin to differentiate, form different organs, and end up with a complex being made up with all sorts of systems within it and so forth. So we're going to get it in a little bit, but I want you to see this animation. What they did is they figured out a way to photograph an embryo, mouse embryo, just in its initial stages of reproduction, and they're able to track the individual cells as they reproduce and as they move. So when a cell reproduces, you see this little red dot. So that was a new cell, and then you'll see the cells beginning to move to different parts of the embryo. And I think this is the beginning of starting to form the individual organs within the embryo. So I think it's just fascinating. So let me play this. What this shows three different views of the embryo, and there's an embryo coordinate system, which I don't understand, but these views are along the different axes of the embryo coordinate system. So now you can see those little things that look like little targets that popped up. All those little flashes are cells, are new cells. They're basically marking cell division. And you're beginning to see some basic structure to the embryo. It's not a sphere, it's getting elongated. And pretty soon you'll see this central cavity forming within the embryo. There it is right there. What it is, as these cells divide, they now are turning on and off different genes within their DNA, so that they're not, in a sense, identical to the original embryo. It's all sorts of switches are being flicked one way or another so that they can become the different organs and move to the right places and stuff like that. So here they are, they're actually comparing two different systems for tracking the cells. So you have an upper view and a lower view, but they're really using two different algorithms for tracking the cell movement within the embryo. Here's a different view of the embryo. So it showed two. Remember I showed you I talked about those three different views of in the embryo coordinate system. This is the third view. And I think it's interesting how you can see this pulsing, like these waves moving, these waves of movement going through the embryo. How do they know to do this? All right, I think that's enough on that one. So that's the early stages. Now I have one other video I want to show you. And this is, it's actually animation, computer-generated animation, but I'm sure it's based on real photography that they've done on growth of a chick. So in the lower left, you'll see a diagram of the egg and then how big the embryo is inside of that egg. And notice all the blood vessels going into the yolk to pull in moisture into the embryo for it to grow. Again, this is all those cells moving to different parts and kind of getting reprogrammed with switches being turned on and off so they can become the different elements of the chick. See how big the embryo is relative to the shell. So it isn't over, right? Because the chicken continues to grow and become a mature adult. So that growth now continues. And so all that's programmed into the cells. In fact, into that first cell that was the fertilized egg. So anyway.
I'd like to say the question you asked before, how the one about the mouse embryo where you can see the different cell types going to different places, like how that is made is actually quite similar to what people do when they want to know what elements are in the universe. and they go trying to find spectra that characterizes different elements. Here, pretty similar. In microscopy, you can aim to go for the spectra would be specific genes that characterize some known cells. So you can ask, I'm gonna try to see the skin cells. They know that they're characterized by 3, 4, 5 marker genes. So they say, that's what I want to see. And that's when that lights up, they know this must be a skin cell.
Yeah.
And then gut cell, the genes are different. So it's similar in that way.
Yeah. Cool. There is a video online that explains this process too. I don't know if it goes into that detail, but you can see the apparatus that it was done with and some of the imaging they're used for. But that's pretty neat. All right, so where are we? We're back here. And I just think, when I see this stuff, I just marvel at God. So, how many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creature beyond number, living things, both large and small. And we talked about God as the one who gives the breath of life. He's the one that gives life. So it all, comes from him. However you want to explain how that happens, but the breath of life is God's breath. And he's the one that gives us life, and we are totally dependent on him. So anyway, now what I want to do is move on to the human body. So this book, I have a library, heretical library back there. But anyway, so this book is called Your Design Body. So it's written by an engineer and an MD. So MD, of course, understands the medical aspects of things, but the engineer comes in, trying to understand the systems and hierarchy and so forth that are involved in the making of the body. And so I read the book, and I think it's fascinating. Here's what it says on the cover. It says, "Consider your body. Every day it must solve hundreds of hard engineering problems simultaneously, or else you will die. While you're going about your daily business, your body stores, retrieves, translates, and manages software for thousands of proteins, switches, set points, thresholds, feedback loops, coordinate systems, counters, and timers." So if you're a control systems engineer, you might have understood what I was saying. All right? So it disassembles thousands of different complex molecules, converts them into their building blocks, absorbs the building blocks, and reassembles them into legions of chemicals and proteins that keep you going. That's the digestive system. Okay? Your body also safely transports hazardous chemicals to where they're needed. So we have these hazardous chemicals, and they can only take certain routes, because if they you don't want them wrecking near your neighborhood and stuff like that. Well, there's hazardous chemicals your body needs. So iron, copper, some of these trace metals, you need them in your diet, but they're dangerous except at their final destination, right? So without spilling them in places where they do no harm, and employs them as it orchestrates thousands of complex processes and movements, some nearly instantaneous. At the same time, it defends itself against threats large and small, and reproduces its own parts to replace those that are worn out, and this is only a tiny portion of what your body must do to remain alive, all without conscious input from you. All right? Now, I talked about transferring hazardous chemicals. So to do that, your body must do several things. One, it must know that these chemical substances are needed and have a way to harvest them in the right quantities from the environment. Number 2, the body must be able to transport each using an appropriate specialized molecule that renders it incapable of interacting with the wrong chemical substances or being in the wrong places. So it gets wrapped in a little protein container so it can go through the body to the right place and not spill, right? Causing an environmental disaster. Okay, number 3, then the body must transport the given chemical substance to the point of use where it is unbound from the container. The container is emptied at the right spot. And finally, then the chemical substance must be fabricated into the special protein that's needed for a particular use at a particular time and place. For example, hemoglobin. So it has little iron, that's what binds to the oxygen, iron molecules. So anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. I have a copy of the book back there. You're welcome to look at it. So next I want to talk about animal behavior. So this is a book which I didn't bring called Complex Program Behaviors. And so this is written by another engineer, I'm sorry to say, but he's actually, a control system electrical type engineer. And so he's just been fascinated by instinctual behavior, a behavior that arises from instinct. It's not learned. So he calls these complex program behaviors. And the way he defines complex program behaviors, number one, it's complex. So either the behavior is sophisticated or it's a very complex system that's producing the behavior. It's not a reflex. Like when you hit your knee and it jumps up. It's not a reflex. It's something a lot more sophisticated than that. Number one, it's purposeful. So the behavior is goal-directed, trying to get from point A to point B, or do this or do that. So it's behavior that's goal-directed. Number three, it's program. So it's algorithmic in character. It involves information processing, procedure, and branching. So this is programming, all right? Number four, it's contingent. That means there's not only one way you could do it. It's like vertical flight. You could have a helicopter, you could have a tilt rotor. So there's not one way. There's not just one way to solve the problem. And finally, it's heritable. So it's inherited. So it's passed from one generation to another, and it's passed through the genes. It's not primarily learned behavior. So I've passed on learned behavior, unfortunately, to my kids. Okay. Their sense of humor and things like that. But there's also program behavior, which they don't have any choice about, like, liking girls and stuff like that. But anyway, so anyway, that's what he means by complex program behavior. And here's some examples of it. One would be navigation and migration. So how do these birds and insects that go large distance, thousands of miles, how do they navigate? It could be an ant that's out searching for food. How does he find his way back to the nest? So that has to do with navigation and migration. So a lot of animals do it. You got turtles, you got butterflies, insects, and you got birds. What?
Salmon.
Salmon, oh yeah, salmon, yeah. So the next would be complex program society. So you'll see a colony of bees or a colony of ants, and very differentiated, just like human society, to accomplish a lot of stuff with brains that are smaller than the head of a pin. But somehow they form like an aggregate brain, and they accomplish this amazing stuff that's only rivaled by mammals themselves, their complex behavior. And then there's insect architecture. So you have insects building honeycombs. You have termites building termite mounds. Well, these termite mounds actually are pretty sophisticated architecturally. Part of it is controlling the heat. They manage the flow of heat into and out of the home, so they don't get too hot or too cold for the termites. So those are some examples. So I want to show you an example of a leafcutter ants. Excuse me. So I love these passages. Proverbs chapter 6 says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." So who created the ant? Who gave the ant its wisdom, so to speak? It's God, right? And we have in the book of Job, is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle soars and builds its nest on high? No, right? It's by God's understanding, and it's by God's command. And so that's what Job is saying there. So, the big question, of course, is how did this all come to be? So, the current theory is that these behaviors and systems and so forth evolved over long periods of time. So I wanted to go into the theory of evolution. I would say there's actually multiple theories of evolution, but I would say there's one dominant one because I think is fully naturalistic, and so we'll talk about that in a minute. So, what is evolution? Well, the word really means gradual development of something, especially from a single to a more complex form. So you might say that your views on a particular topic have evolved different things. So we use the word in everyday language, and really what it refers to is small change over time. It just slowly morphs into one and another. And I think, biologists have always recognized that something like this is going on in the natural world, that it seems like species have changed over time, or at least they only show up in certain periods of time and so forth. It seems as if they changed over time. It seems as if they migrated around the world. They kind of slowly change from one form to another as you go to different parts of the world, and they adapt and so forth. You look in the metro parks, you go into Lake to Lake Trail, and you're seeing this invasive ornamental grass that's kind of taken over the reeds that are there, and so you can see the environment changing from year to year as different species take over. And so I think there's always been this perception, or there has been a perception of this, a growing perception of this ever since the 1700s at least. But it was in 1860 that Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, what I would call Darwinian evolution, and the key about his theory was that it was fully naturalistic. So it involved random mutation from generation to generation, and then natural selection. So what the natural selection does is it now filters out mutations that are harmful and kind of preserves beneficial mutations for the next generation. And then over long periods of time, this would lead to, as you get a bunch of small changes added up, then they result in big changes, right? So this then, according to the Darwinian evolution, led to all the complexity and diversity that we see in life today, all descended from the same common ancestor. So the elements in Darwinism is just Darwin's theory with Mendelian genetics incorporated into it. So they didn't know how traits were passed on from one generation to another, when Darwin was around, but they figured that out later, and so that was incorporated into the theory too. So the elements involves random variation. So the random variation we understand today is due to environmental degradation of the genetic material and copying errors. It's due to horizontal gene transfer. So some organisms can get genetic material from others, and I think this is primarily among prokaryotes. And then there's sexual reproduction, right? So I would say that's not random because God brought my wife to me, but in a larger sense, you could call it random or pseudo-random. Okay, and then natural selection. So this is the process whereby the most fit organisms are the ones most likely to pass their genes on to the next generation. And so this is the term where survival of the fittest comes, which you've heard before. Okay, and then part of Darwinian evolution is that species are not constant, but they've developed over long periods of time, and they're continuing to develop. And so we have the process of speciation, whereas species and a species as it's in different locations, they kind of take different routes through their gradual changes, and eventually they're separated enough to where they actually can't get together and produce viable offspring. So that's kind of this idea of speciation. And then there's common descent, and that means as you go back, so that means that evolution has this branching character to it, and then complexity increases with time, and a single common ancestor of all is inferred. I personally think this is an acknowledgement that the origin of life is an extremely improbable event. Although there's some that have entertained, it could have arisen several times on Earth and so forth. But anyway, and the process is very gradual, so it requires small incremental changes from generation to generation. And the origin of life from non-life is assumed. I don't think it's part of Darwin's theory, but it certainly is, in a sense, part of it now. So in summary, it is considered a comprehensive, naturalistic explanation of life, and so no intervention is required. So the process is blind, that is, there's no foresight as to what mutations are required for survival, and then it's purposeless in that there's no directing intelligence. It's strictly a naturalistic process. So how is it believed that works? So this is the tree of life that's, I think, pretty much accepted today. So way back eons, you have what's called the LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And so if you trace the lineage of bacteria and humans all the way back, eventually you'll find them in this last universal common ancestor. And you can see this branching evolution like this requires immense amounts of time. And so the current thought is that Earth is like 4.5 billion years old. So as you go through the geologic record, there was the Hadean age, which I would call hellish. So everything was molten and so forth. So that was, just after Earth formed, and the water is, appearing too. And then the Luca is way back there. It seems almost as if the Earth was habitable, that life arose. And then you have the single-celled life after that, and then you have photosynthesis. And you can see the large eons over which these creatures lived. And it wasn't until relatively recently in geologic time that you started having dinosaurs and birds and humans and so forth. So anyway, so that's basically, I would call that the theory of the evolution. And like I say, it's explained in terms of Darwinian evolution, this process, this mindless, purposeless, or blind, purposeless process manifesting itself over time. So the question is can that really explain what we see today? Okay, so you may have heard of the intelligent design movement. Some of the pioneers in that were Thaxton, Olson, and I think one other guy. So they're smart guys. They got their PhD. They don't have a problem with long geologic ages and stuff like that, but they started questioning, could life really have originated by chance? It can't have been by chance. And so they wrote this book back in 1984 saying, this doesn't make sense. You don't have any evidence that this is what happened. And then along came Michael Denton in 1985, and he pointed out a bunch of issues in the theory of evolution, whether it had to do with the tree of life, whether it had to do with probabilities. Came up with a number of objections back into 1985, and his was called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. So he pointed out some of these disconnects in Darwinian theory. Turns out he's not a Christian. I think he's an agnostic, or he was back then. And I don't sense he's a Christian today even. And then in 1981, a guy by the name of Paul Johnson came out with a book called Darwin on Trial. So he's actually not a science guy, he's a lawyer. He used his knowledge of law and logic to analyze arguments of Darwinian evolution, and he concluded that the arguments are extremely weak, that life occurred in this way. I remember reading an article in Science magazine, because my dad had a subscription to that. It was a review by Stephen Gould, who was one of the big famous peoples a generation ago, advocates of evolution. He was actually a paleontologist, and he did a review of Darwin on Trial, and I remember reading that review, and it was pretty pathetic. It was he really wasn't addressing the arguments that Paul Johnson was addressing. And then came along Michael Behe's book. So again, these guys are all really smart people, do their own research and so forth. So Behe wrote Darwin's Black Box, and his thesis was, we really don't know how evolution works down at the nuts and bolts level. We engineers like to say the devil's in the details, right? You can come up with wonderful ideas, but it boils down, do I have room to get a socket wrench over this nut so that I can tighten it? Will the fillets on my two parts interface? Can I actually do this? And like I say, it gets down to the nuts and bolts level. And he said, we really didn't know how it operated at the nuts and bolts level. And he looked through all the literature and he said, there's nobody who's really shown any of these features, how it was accomplished in a step-by-step way at the molecular level. You had this mutation, then you had that mutation, and so forth. So that was kind of his thesis. Again, it made a big splash. Of course, a lot of negative press and so forth. So this is the intelligent design movement. Intelligent design doesn't disparage long geologic periods of time. It doesn't disparage necessarily the tree of life. What it is doing is questioning assumptions, and it says basically you can't explain everything by purposeless random process. That there is evidence of intelligent cause below a certain level, intelligent cause. There's mind involved. And so this is what design is. Design, I don't like the term intelligent design, because design is, by definition, involves intelligence. I just like to use the word design. But basically, you see design down at these deepest levels. Our mind, our intuition tells us this didn't happen by chance. So we get into that. So that's kind of what it's saying. It says at some level that you need something coming in from the outside. It's intelligence. However this intelligence accomplish it shows intelligence behind them. You can't explain it through random mutations and natural selection. So that's their basic thesis. Well, this is a growing movement back in the late 1990s. You know, now schools are trying to put intelligent design in their curriculum, school boards and all this kind of stuff. And so there was a famous lawsuit back in Pennsylvania called Kitzmiller versus Dover Area District. So Kitzmiller was suing the school district because they were requiring the teaching of intelligent design. And so there was a big trial. Some of these authors that I showed you before testified and so forth. And so basically the ruling concluded that intelligent design was not science, and the ruling permanently barred the board from requiring teachers to denigrate or disparage the scientific theory of evolution and from requiring ID to be taught as an alternative theory. So basically it didn't go the ID way, okay? And there's a documentary, Nova documentary made by this. I have not seen it, but I've read analyses of the trial and of the documentary, and the judge was not objective. There were a lot of improprieties during the trial, and also a lot of misrepresentations in the documentary itself. So I'm just reporting what I've read about that. And so you know how the media has a certain narrative they want to support, and so when you got to always be suspicious when you see documentaries as what narrative are they supporting. So but anyway, so that was kind of a setback for the ID movement. I want to introduce you to some guys here that have been prominent. So a guy by the name of Doug Axe. So he got his PhD at Caltech, and he held postdoctoral and research scientist positions at the University of Cambridge and the Cambridge Medical Research Council Center. He was canceled in 2002. So his sin, I like to say, was associating with the Discovery Institute, which promotes intelligent design, and that he himself was a believer in ID. And so basically he was forced to leave the Center for Protein Engineering in Cambridge, England. And I think what it was is, I think people knew what his position was and what his views were, but I think it got into the press, and they were, I think, worried about a lot of negative press and, a big uproar, in the British media. And so they said, we don't want this guy anymore. And so they said, sorry, we took your bench, we gave it to somebody else. So anyway, and then Richard Sternberg was an evolutionary biologist at the Smithsonian. And he was an editor of a magazine. Unfortunately, he accepted a paper from Steve Meyer, who is a proponent of intelligent design. And as a result, again, there was a big uproar within the Smithsonian. So his sin was authorizing this report by Dr. Stephen Meyer to be published in this journal after peer review. And he faced retaliation, defamation, harassment, and a hostile work environment at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History that was designed to force him out. I will go into Günter Beckley, though. So he's a German paleontologist, an expert in insects, in particular dragonflies, a big proponent of evolution. He was a curator at the State Museum of Natural History. Well, he began to doubt Darwinism as he encountered some of the writings of Behe and others, and in 2015, he declared, you know what, I think this intelligent design stuff makes sense. And so as a result, so that was his sin. As a result, he was pressured to leave his position. And by the way, his page was removed from Wikipedia. It was completely purged. So there's a guy at Jet Propulsion Lab years ago. I think this was back in like 2011 or 2012. He wasn't a biologist, I don't know if he was in IT, but he was caught sharing materials on intelligent design at work. And as a result, he was fired. So there's a lot of, so it's the kind of thing that's going on today. You have what you call a standard narrative, a dominant narrative, and when you begin to question it, it almost seems like the Darwinism is an orthodoxy for a lot of people, and so therefore you can't question it. And so what happens is these people question it, and then they got punished. So, and I will have to say, this is not true of everywhere. All right, there are places, Michael Behe hasn't lost his position. There's other people over in Europe and America. They're advocates of intelligent design or friends of intelligent design, and they're not threatened by their stuff. So these are just some cases, but what it does is it creates a fear for people in the field to kind of fess up that they're having doubts about the dominant narrative. And what that does is that squelches research, it squelches information. Science is supposed to be open. We should be able to have questioning ideas and so forth. So anyway.
Stephen A. Meyer's book, Darwin doubt is really good.
Yeah. Yeah, he's read a number. He's written a lot over the years. So, what are the arguments that get made against design in biology? One of the big ones is that the theory of intelligent design, is not a valid scientific theory. One reason is because it's not testable. So, can you do an experiment, to show that it was true? Well, this is somewhat applicable to Darwinian evolution. In some aspects, it's not testable. But the other thing is, the big thing is, it is looking outside of nature. So what it does is it points to an intelligence. All right, there's intelligence behind this. So if the intelligence was an alien, that's an okay theory. But if it's God, that's not. Right? Because God is outside of nature, so you can't really entertain that, And yet design is as an inference is used in other science and technical fields. Archaeology, right? You're looking for something that is natural. Radio astronomy, that was somebody turned on their razor. That wasn't natural, And then you have the SETI, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They're looking for non-natural signals. And then in crime forensics, you see these detective shows where, this happened and that happened, and then Colombo comes in and he says, well, that's no coincidence, right? There was some intent behind that. So, you use that in crime forensics and spycraft. So why can't we use that in biology also? And it turns out the language of design is quite common in biology. They often talk about something, the design of something. You have the function of things, and all this language you use in control systems and so forth. That would be the language of engineering, but also the language of design, and you'll see that in there. So anyway, that's that objection. Another one is design theory is another form of the God of the gaps. So that means we can't explain it, and so God did it. All right, so, it turns out there's evolution of the gaps too. So here's one. It has to do with the origin of sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction always been a problem for Darwinism. So how did it come about? And so they had two theories. The first theory says sex evolved to prevent parasite infections. So the sexual reproduction allows the mixing of genes, and so a pathogen that targets a particular kind of protein structure in a cell that can change because of the sexual reproduction, and therefore the parasites are held off in future generations. So basically it's that sexual reproduction allows a gene to be mixed and for the life to adapt. The other is that sexual reproduction evolved to preserve the integrity of species, which is the exact opposite, right? So and these papers, I think, came out at around the same time. So oftentimes what you'll see is what I call just so stories. So, evolution happened, and therefore let's come up with this, story, this chain of events that could have led. But that's what it is. It's really what I would call a just so story, like how did the tiger get its stripes, or something like that. And often what you'll see as you see theories about evolutionary origin, they'll explain, well, this happened because the environment changed, right? The environment changed, so it would select for this kind of thing. So, their theory says how did the fittest survive, so to speak? But it doesn't explain how that fitness arose to begin with, the innovation that it required. And that's missing. So unless just because you said the oxygen content in the atmosphere went up, therefore we ended up having multicellular organisms. Well, how did that happen? Right? You're just saying that in response to this happened, but how do those innovations derive to begin with in order for that to happen? So that is God of the gaps. So I want to talk about this thing about methodological naturalism. So the practice of science today adopts methodological naturalism. I mean, basically what it does is says natural causes are the only ones that are permitted as valid scientific explanations. And I think this is a reasonable assumption in day-to-day practice of science and engineering. I never appealed to miracles. I may have asked for miracles, but I never appealed to miracles, in the stuff that I designed and stuff. So you don't do that and we have a basis for thinking that in the fact that we have a supremely rational God who created it. that things are going to behave in certain ways, and they behave in that way because that's the way God made them to, right? So, but, what if God actually did intervene in history? The science is caught in this infinite do loop, Okay, I have an explanation. May test the explanation. It didn't work. Oh, okay, go back. Now I have to come up with another explanation. You modify it. So you keep going around and around, but you're never allowed to include the correct explanation, which is God intervened in history, right? So you're caught in this infinite do loop. And I think that's a flaw in the practice of science. Instead of inferring the best natural cause, maybe we should do inference to the best cause. And if intelligence is the most reasonable explanation, then that's it. Okay, what if you can't go beyond that? Okay. But at least you know that intelligence is behind that, okay? And I like to say this is particularly true in when you consider the origin of things, such as the universe, humankind, and the mind itself. So anyway, so this one, design theory means thousands of miracles, okay? And my feeling is, well, you follow the evidence where it leads. Okay, you have 1,000 miracles. How many events occurred in the universe? Turns out the miraculous events of God's directly intervening history is extremely small still, right? Okay, and certainly we know that it's not so unusual once mankind arrived on the scene, because we saw earlier that rational thought requires something from outside of the universe poking in. And we as believers in Christ, we experience the supernatural every day through the indwelling Holy Spirit. And so that is something from the outside influencing matter and energy directly through us, right? Impact on the natural world. So that should be true of each of our lives. All right, so finally, I want to just talk about this. So we talked about nature being this closed system. I used this illustration several weeks ago. So you have this big terrarium, right? Okay, so the naturalists would view this as not transparent, right? The lid isn't there. It's welded on or whatever. And no light or heat can get in there. It has to run on batteries. So, but is that really a good assumption? I mean, with this terrarium, you have light coming in all the time. And so I think we need to question whether nature is really this super tight system that we tend to assume in science. And so I think with that, I went over. So I have more to discuss, but I think I focused on the big things. So let's pray, and then if you have questions or comments, you can hit me up afterwards. So, all right.